Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. History has become a contentious subject in India. The history taught in schools and colleges over the years is now being challenged by right-wing forces who are currently the establishment, who say that it is not authentic and Indian enough. Older historians say their books are based on research. Now, new books have emerged which seek to correct those alleged mistakes in the narratives. But is there an accurate version of Indian history? Is it possible to be neutral at all? A brand new book, The Shortest History of India, has just been published, and the author is John Zubrzycki, an Australian who has encapsulated 5,000 years of this land's civilizational history in about 270 pages. We'll talk about that bit a little later. This book takes the traditional view of Indian history. John is what is called an old India hand. He has a PhD in Indian history and has worked in this country as a foreign correspondent and as a diplomat. He is the author of 4 earlier books: The Shortest History of India, Apart, The House of Jaipur, On the Royal Family of Jaipur, Empire of Enchantment, which is a story of Indian magic, of Jadugars and Jinns, The Mysterious Mr. Jacob, Diamond Merchant, Magician and Spy, and The Last Nizam, which is about the last remaining descendant of the first Nizam of Hyderabad. John Zubrzycki, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sidharth. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Why a book on Indian history and why now?
Look, as you said in your introduction, history has become politicized, it's become contentious. The history of India is being rewritten for political purposes. So it's a fresh look at Indian history at any point in time is important, but particularly on the 75th anniversary of India's independence, which is when the book came out, just a couple of days before that. So it's important to not just for Indian readers, because this book is being published internationally. It's important for readers around the world to understand what is going on in India. And in order, this is the old adage, I'm not the first person to repeat this, but in order to understand to make sense of the present, you have to understand the past, and also understanding the past of one's own country, one's own history prepares you better to face the challenges of the future. So these are all reasons why a history of India is important. For me, it was obviously a challenging undertaking, as you say, squeezing 5,000 years of history into about 270 pages. In fact, I'm squeezing about more than that, because I do start with the out of Africa migration, which came about 65,000 years ago. And it's, it was when my publisher in Australia asked me if I was interested in doing this shortest history, I embraced the challenge immediately. For me, it was a great opportunity to go back over what I'd learnt, what I had studied over more than 40 years of academic scholarship, journalism, writing about various aspects of Indian history in the books that you've mentioned. So it was challenging, but incredibly satisfying as well.
Yeah, you do know a lot of people are going to say, what kind of history is this which misses out on A, B, C? But again, keep that question in mind. I have some more questions to ask on that. When you say India, what exactly do you mean? Because the modern state was born only 75 years ago. Before that, there were hundreds of kingdoms and principalities. Was there really an India?
Well, India as a concept, it is a foreign concept in a way. I mean, originally it was the land to the east of the what is now the Indus River. And, it was always, there was the India of the imagination. There was a geographic India. There was the India which at times came together as a political entity, which happened under the Mauryas, under the Guptas, under the Mughals, and then under the British in various different configurations. So yes, it's a very valid point. I mean, what we today consider India was not really thought of as an entity until arguably the British came along and conquered most of the subcontinent in eventually after about 1818. So it is and it's still a contentious subject. I mean, if you believe the RSS rhetoric and what they consider to be India when they speak of Akhand Bharat, which is a territory stretching from Afghanistan in the west through to Burma in the east. I mean, that's another way of defining what India could be, and in fact, it's considered to be a goal of the RSS to achieve that Akhand Bharat. It may be only a rhetorical goal, but it's there. So yeah, there are these different concepts. I do take perhaps, yes, maybe a traditional view of what India is, but that's I saw my purpose as a historian to bring as many different aspects of Indian history together as possible, explain the origins of India as a state, and also to look at where it's going to go to from now.
So, the traditional view, as it were, which Pandit Nehru in Discovery of India also highlighted, that there was always a civilizational entity, which was called India. As you say, it's the India of imagination, but it is also India of practices, traditions, and perhaps cultures, and something that spread. So, are you saying that you went by that to say that let us look at India as something that always has existed, whether during the Mughals it was Hindustan, or whether under the British it was India, British India, as they say, which also did not include many kingdoms which were under their control, but did not come under them directly. So, was there always this civilizational idea?
Well, I do introduce the book with Nehru's concept of what India is, this, this civilization, as you say, this incredible melting pot of different cultures and religions and so on, bound together, irrespective of ethnicity, of religion and so on. And I think that that's important because he sees it as he considers that his particular secular point of view, which he of course developed and stood by and then expanded on when India became an independent country. So yes, I mean in India, in the civilizational sense, is as Nehru had defined it, was my starting point. I think very deliberately because I wanted to express, kind of convey this entity as something that is not something that you can define by set borders at any particular stage of its history, except maybe if you look at the length of Indian history, then, the British period where, you could actually draw boundaries around what was British India and that these were pretty stable is a drop in the bucket. And what was India before that is hard to define other than in a civilizational sense, I believe.
The book opens with the discovery of the Harappan ruins by the British, first by a contractor, then by an archaeologist. Though, of course, as you pointed out, you go back even further when the migrants came from Africa and then from other places. How important, ironically, the Harappan ruins are no longer in the geographical entity called India, but how important are those ruins, the discovery of those ruins, and what do they say about us?
Look, they were very important because until really, of course, they were discovered, 1856, first surveyed by the Archaeological Survey of India in the decades afterwards, but it was only really in the around about the 1920s that we began to get a real a sense of what this civilization might have looked like and what it represented and how important it was. So really, the discovery of the Harappan civilization took, what we knew about Indian history back, several thousand years. The Harappan civilization itself dates back to about 3,500 BCE. So, it is, and of course, it may not be the Hindutva view of history, but certainly Harappa had a huge influence on the development of Indian civilization, religion, society, etc. It was a huge civilization. It was at its peak larger than Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. It was a highly organized civilization. So you had, for instance, you would find the same roughly layout of streets, public buildings, etc., whether it was Harappa, whether it was Haru in Gujarat, whether it was an outpost in Afghanistan of the civilization. It traded widely as far west as the Middle East. It was a secular, as far as we can tell, society as well, and an egalitarian one. All of these things make it an extraordinary civilization. Unfortunately, because we haven't been able to decipher the script, if that's what it is, if that's what these symbols on the Harappan seals are, this Indian history will always be contentious, because those forces or those scholars who wish to rewrite what we know about Indian history will use this ambiguity in order to project a particular interpretation of the origins of Indian civilization, or particularly Hindu civilization.
So in this encapsulated version of 5,000 years, as you said, and you're bound to have left out something, and you're bound to have included something. Did you feel that you were deliberately having to leave something?
Look, it's impossible to, in the space of, my publisher gave me 50,000 words initially as my word limit. I think it came out to about 65,000 in the end. Of course, you're going to leave things out. Of course, you're going to skim over dynasties. You're going to omit certain rulers. For much of Indian history, it was a hotspot of kingdoms, often warring kingdoms, spread across this vast subcontinent. So I would have been amiss to just concentrate on what was going on in North India, without mentioning, the Chola empires of South India, and the Pandyas and some of the other great dynasties that existed down there. At the same time, looking at what was going on in Bengal during the Delhi Sultanate, looking at what was going on in Kashmir, for instance, in the lead up to independence. The whole Kashmir independence struggle is something that, books have been written about, but, I've had to give it a pretty brief description. So look, it was a challenge. I believe, even having read other short histories, there are a few, that mine is fairly comprehensive. As you said in your introduction, it will give readers a sense of the chronology of their history, of its peaks, its troughs, its glory, its achievements, the impact that India had on the rest of the world, whether through science, religion, and the arts. So I tried to bring all these different elements into it, as well as document as concisely as I could, what becomes a very complicated, messy history as India makes the transition to independence and afterwards, particularly after the end of the hegemony, if you like, of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, when you started to get coalition governments and regional players start to influence politics at the center, when you get the rise of the BJP and so on. That was a challenge too, but I didn't want to drown the reader with just endless names and dates and, going from one battle to another, going from one bloody overthrow of a ruler, to another. I wanted to put a human face where I could on India's history, and I wanted to just give the reader something that would resonate with them. And again, it was a challenge, because I knew I was writing for multiple audiences. In the end, the editors of my Indian edition asked for very, very few changes. Indeed, they wanted it to be brought a little bit more up to date politically. But I'm writing not just for an Indian audience, but for a worldwide audience, and an Indian audience might be familiar with most of what I've written, but an audience, say in China or South America, will find a lot of what I've come across quite new.
But still, John, your decision to leave out something and perhaps include something also is bound to upset someone or the other. So, for example, how do you deal with whether Babur was invited to India by a Rajput king, or the defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan, which is now being challenged? We are being told he never lost, he won. Or at least it was an honorable defeat. How would you deal with this? There are many other instances which I think are a little controversial, shall we say, by today's standards.
Look, Sidharth, everything's going to be controversial, and particularly in this politically charged atmosphere. I guess if the censors and the BJP had their way, the book would be much shorter, wouldn't it? There wouldn't be much on the Harappan Civilization. The Mughal period would probably be condensed to a few footnotes, as would the British Raj. But look, for me, it's actually difficult to keep up with all these controversies. That's the first time I've heard of that one. I can only go by, writing a book like this. I rely on, sources that have been, that have not been questioned in the past, that are based on solid research, archival research. And as far as possible, history is always going to be, the further back you go, particularly, there's always going to be an element of guesswork. And it's, history is often written by the victors, not by the losers. So that's going to throw bias on things as well. I mean, you look at the Mughal period, and which is terrific because you've got so many chroniclers of that period, but they've all got their, a lot of them have got an agenda that they're pushing as well. So, one has to be cautious, and of course, a book like this is going to upset some people, and they're going to no doubt question it and so on. But look, that's unavoidable. If that, people cannot be prevented or cowed or, frightened off from writing this sort of history just because there is going to be some controversy at the end. And, new discoveries are going to be made all the time. Hopefully archaeological evidence will uncover more facts about the Harappan civilization than we know today. And, maybe, hopefully, put an end to some of the, revisionism that's going on at this time about what India was in those days.
Yeah, revisionism is absolutely correct, but certain complaints, in a manner of speaking, certain observations that are now emerging more vocally than ever before is that there is a growing anger, even that far, to say that all histories of India are fully focused on the north. You did mention that you have written about the Cholas and even the Bengalis, but someone or the other is going to say you did not give the emphasis on the Cholas that you gave the Mauryas, for example. The Ashoka's edicts now are a symbol. So were you sensitive to these concerns while you were writing?
Well, I was trying to be, but at the same time, this is, as the name says, the shortest history of India. Now, it may not be the shortest, but the idea is to give readers something that they can read in a few days, easily digest, without undermining the scholarly foundations on which the history is written. So, I've gone back to some of the classic books that have been written on Indian history, for this particular work, starting with, the works by people like A.L. Basham, who was my lecturer at university, S.A.A. Rizvi, who wrote the companion volume to The Wonder That Was India. And as I said, it's not going to please everyone, but, given the constraints that I was placed under, it's obviously going to displease some people that I didn't give more weight to this particular epoch of history or this particular dynasty or cultural achievements of, say the Cholas or the Badami kingdom, or the Adil Shahis, all these different kingdoms. I mean, I would be losing the reader as well if I tried to mention every single dynasty in detail, every single ruler, every single transition to power, every invasion, and so on. It would just extend to volumes, which and the idea is also just to give people, if they want to find out more about a particular figure, about a particular kingdom, about a particular event, then there is a bibliography there, and they can do further reading. Yeah, it's always going to be a problem for the historian, and what I can say is that I believe that it is comprehensive and balanced and based on scholarly research. So in that sense, I can only stand by what's been published, what's there in the written word.
We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the Wire Talks. The Cholas do get quite a few pages, so do the Marathas. In fact, now I'm noticing on social media, as well as new books being published, what I call retro history, looking back and imagining things. It doesn't matter if they don't correspond with the facts. So coming to the Mughals, now treacherous area now in today's day and age. The chapter on the Mughals is the longest. They were seen as rulers who assimilated with the land, married Hindu princesses, and contributed greatly in terms of culture, architecture, language, and administration. Now, that's the view which has been with us for many, many years, many decades. But now they are seen as out and out villains who were responsible. And in fact, many people are now today being called on saying sorry for the Mughals. And your chapter is called The Magnificent Moguls. So how did you negotiate that part?
Look, again, I do believe that they contributed a lot to Indian civilization. You mentioned art, you mentioned administration. Much of their rule was marked by assimilation, syncretism. So it's an important epoch, and they, look, no one surely could quibble with the artistic and architectural heritage that they left behind. We also have them. We also can thank them for instance, under the rule of Akbar, translating the Ramayana and the Mahabharata into Persian. And it was those Persian translations which were then translated into English. It didn't come straight from, it wasn't, the European world came to know so much about India thanks to what these translators did. So look, I think I'm justified in calling them the Magnificent Moguls. It's not just an alliteration, it's a description which they deserve. I mean, of course, not all of the Mughal rulers were as great as, say, Akbar himself. Of course, Aurangzeb is, among many Indian historians, a much reviled figure. Humayun, you would not necessarily count as being one of the great Mughals. There's some achievements that he can be credited to him. But it is. I do believe that as a dynasty, they left an indelible mark on India, one that India really ought to be proud of.
I'll stay with the Mughals for a while. The traditional view has been that Akbar was largely benevolent and syncretic, and was perhaps not even a full-fledged Muslim. I think he had begun to believe in Sufi saints, while the traditional view also says that Aurangzeb was completely cruel, anti-Hindus, anti-Indians, and there was no redeeming feature. I think you bring a little bit of nuance to that to say that Akbar, in his early part of his reign, did some unspeakable things, and Aurangzeb wasn't as bad as he has been made out to be. People have got into trouble for saying these things.
That's right. Look, I think one aspect that's often forgotten, and probably haven't really brought it out in my book, is that the Mughals, the brand of Islam that they brought to India came from Central Asia. This was not the hardline Salafist Islam that later came out of the Arabian Peninsula. It was already a milder form of Islam that they brought with them from Central Asia. Aurangzeb, of course, yes, the longer he ruled, the more pious he became, the more intolerant he became. But in general, there are a few things. I mean, I think that the Mughals realized that if they were to rule over India, they had to be tolerant. I mean, they couldn't afford to antagonize the local populations. There was not this fervent need on their part felt that they had to convert vast numbers of Indians. After all, and there was the jizya attack on non-Muslims, which was an important source of income for them. So the fewer non-Muslims there were, the less of this tax they could collect. So there wasn't this proselytization. There wasn't that wasn't that need for conversion that is often associated with Islamic rulers in any country. So I think you've got to take this more nuanced view of the Mughals represented, how they went about their rule. As you say, there was intermarriage among the emperors, with particularly the Rajput princes. So it's this is an important things. These are important aspects to keep in mind.
Now, coming to the British, the chapter's got a very interesting name: Merchants and Mercenaries, and I think that's pretty accurate because many of them were buccaneers who you show that the French were called in to help the Hyderabadi Nizams. And that became a precedent that the colonials, later the British, who had come as traders, began running the kingdom from behind the scenes. Various laws were also put in place, including the doctrine of lapse. Now, that implies that they couldn't have succeeded in a vast country like India without Indian help. So it puts a new complexion. Of course, we've known this, but it puts a new complexion to the idea that the colonials came, started trading, and simply took over.
Yes, that's right. I mean, both the French and the British used their proxies to gain territory, but also they were reflecting some of the conflicts that were going on in India at the time between the French and the British. Of course, were not just over territory, but they were reflecting wars that were going on back in Europe. Sometimes news that those wars had ended took so long to reach India that they kept on fighting in India, even though peace had been signed back in Europe. But yes, look, in a way, I mean, the British were, I guess, particularly skilled at this, and Hyderabad is a very good example of enlisting the support of these local players in expansionist policies. To an extent, they didn't do so willingly. The British, by and large, knew when these rulers were at the most vulnerable, imposed on them subsidiary forces, imposed on them taxes and so on that they'd have to pay, and pay for the upkeep of these forces. So it wasn't, yes, they engaged Indian players when it came to conquering India, it wasn't just all based on mercantilism. But at the same time, I don't think that you could say that the Indians necessarily willingly went along with all of this.
Well, in Bengal, Jagat Seth financed the British. The zamindars willingly started imposing tax on the peasants and squeezed them dry because of their agriculture tax laws. In Bombay of the time, the entire merchant class, which then became traders and then industrialists, worked closely with the British. So it was a kind of joint effort which consolidated. Because if you see, I know a bit about the Bombay story, that in the 1850s and 60s, when land was available, it was exploited by the Indians. And they started building these magnificent buildings. And they were even financing the British. So it was a far more complex relationship than saying, they came and they subdued each and every Indian.
Oh, yes, yes. I think I was talking more about the situation in the early 18th century. But yes, certainly, by the time you get the Battle of Plassey and the Jagat Seth's involvement in that, the enlisting of mercantile classes in cities like Bombay and in Western India, yes, certainly, I agree with you.
So, one of the very traditional narrative by Indian historians was that the colonials, especially the British, exploited India's natural resources, finished off India's economy. Now, left historians are saying that the entire period was bad and not only exploitative but cruel. But now new historians in Britain have begun to emerge who say the British Empire was a force for good. What is your conclusion?
I think the idea that the British Empire was a force for good has been around for a very long time. I think that was the whole justification for the Raj and indeed the East India Company before that. Look, it's not as black and white as that, of course. Yes, the British introduced a legal system, uniform legal systems, English language, they built infrastructure, railways and canals in particular. Education was another thing, setting up 4 universities in 1857, and many of India's nationalist leaders went through that university system, of course, or like Gandhi, Jinnah, and others, studied at the bar in London and then went back and used that legal training and that experience of being abroad to pursue their nationalist aims. So, but at the same time, yes, of course, there's tremendous exploitation at every level. This oft-quoted figure that, India's GDP at the beginning of 1600 accounted for about a quarter of all world trade, and by the time the British left, it was down to about 3 or 4%. It's maybe some historians or economists would quibble with that. But the fact is that when India gained its independence, you only have to look at the statistics to see the paucity of primary health clinics, the low rates of literacy, the low rates of industrialization, and so on that the newly independent India inherited. It's obvious from those figures that British rule was exploitative. But at the same time, as I said, you can cite other achievements that they left behind as well. As I said, infrastructure, education, law, and so on.
So, as I said in the beginning, a lot of new histories are being written by and being the old ones are being rejected, that it was all one large left-wing conspiracy to give us the wrong version of our own history, which is not Indian enough, or whatever that means. And now new histories are being written. School textbooks are changing, college textbooks are changing. The new dispensation has its own people in charge of culture and education, two very, very, very important subjects as far as the BJP is concerned, and which is no different in that sense from earlier, except that earlier there was a little bit more leeway for many other versions also.
Yes.
Will children grow up, the next generations will grow up with this new version? And will they have, let's put a word to it, a warped idea of Indian history?
Well, if they read my book, they won't. But look, Sidharth, I think that there's some merit in the argument that those historians that were strongly influenced by Nehruvian secularism painted perhaps too rosy a picture of, for instance, the syncretism that existed during the Mughal period, or downplay the atrocities that happened, from the time of the first Muslim invasions of India in the 10th, 11th centuries. So, it's quite natural for there to be a correction, and it's good. It's good to have this lively debate, as long as it can be a genuine debate, as long as, one side is not excluded, is not shut down for just saying or questioning something that is some aspect of Indian history that is maybe accepted or has been accepted for centuries. So I think that there's always, it's been happening in Australia, for instance, the way we look back on our, the early colonial period here and the violence that was inflicted Aboriginal people, on the Indigenous people. That history has been revised for the better because, more materials come to light, more research has been done, but also historians are taking a broader view, a more objective view of what went on based on the evidence at hand. A lot of what is going on in India is, of course, disturbing and quite. But I think as long as there is room for debate, as long as these questions can be discussed openly and constructively, then I think that's a good thing. But it's what Indian children will be reading about Indian history 20 years from now. I'm a little bit worried about, but hopefully, I think India's democratic traditions are resilient. Its intellectual curiosity is, if anything, getting stronger, I think. I mean, you've seen some great work coming out in recent decades, casting new light on various aspects of Indian history. So these are positive things. So it's maybe a little bit too early to predict what kids will be reading, what version of Indian history they'll be brought up on, but I haven't given up hope that it will be one that's based on objective historical research and not on some ideologically motivated quest to rewrite, to use history to justify for instance, it's a bit early to imagine what version of Indian history children will be reading in the coming years. But as long as there is room for debate, as long as scholars are not being prevented from pursuing their research, as long as educational institutions are given the sort of freedom that just maintain this tradition of freedom that is necessary for proper history to be written, then I think that things will be, that there's a chance that there'll be a balancing of these interpretations of history, and we'll come up with something that is, that is adding to our understanding of India as this great civilization. Not sure if that made sense.
Okay, well, we are winding up. So that's a good cause for hope. I think you have put it in perspective. I think this book should be read, and it's very, very pacey. And then in the beginning, you've got this dates and events. So it should, even for Indians, at least for this Indian, was an easy and helpful read. So on that note, we'll thank you, John Zubrzycki, for this book and this analytical and, may I say, balanced view of what Indian history is and what it could be. And more power to your idea that there should be more debates. I think debates are always welcome. That was John Zubrzycki, a scholar on India, an old India hand who's written several books on India. And his latest is The Shortest History of India. You should read it, if only to argue with him about some of the things he has kept and some of the things he has left out. But that's what debate is all about. We'll be back next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.